Alors, bienvenue.
Welcome, everyone, this morning to this city of the Standing Committee on Official Languages. Pursuant to Section 11, we will be dealing with the nomination of Madeleine Meilleur to the position of Commissioner of Official Languages referred to the committee on Monday, May 15th. 2017. Welcome, Ms. Meilleur. She has been nominated to the position of Official Languages Commissioner. Ms. Meilleur, I understand that you're going to be talking for about 20 minutes, and then, as usual, we'll have a period of questions and answers. So, we're listening. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and all members of the Official Languages Committee. I first want to express how appreciative I am to have been given the opportunity to present myself. I would like to express how appreciative I am for being selected as a candidate for the position of Commissioner of Official Languages of Canada. It is a sign of confidence that touches me greatly because throughout my public life, the country's linguistic duality has been a source of inspiration and commitment. I applied for the position with a great deal of interest and enthusiasm. I believe I have the recognized relevant knowledge, professional qualifications, and personal skills to fulfill this role competently and effectively.
Has enabled me to evolve and succeed in 3 different fields of competency. First as a nurse, then as a lawyer, and more recently as a provincial member of parliament and minister. At the beginning of my career, I worked as a nurse in a hospital environment, in various specialized services, and performed clinical teaching duties. After going back to school, I practiced as a lawyer specialized in labor and employment law. I worked with both the union and employer communities, thus acquiring experience in mediation and conciliation. During my legal career, I also served as municipal councillor for the City of Ottawa. Ma carrière de député provincial et de ministre du gouvernement.
I served as a provincial member of Parliament and Ontario government minister for a period of 12 years. Throughout that period, I served as the minister responsible for Francophone affairs. In that capacity, I spearheaded important initiatives to ensure the development of the Franco-Ontarian community. These initiatives included the establishment of the Office of the French Language Services Commissioner, the adoption of a more inclusive definition of Francophones, the adoption of regulations on the delivery of French language services by third parties on behalf of governmental organizations, the autonomy of the TFO television channel, and more recently, the setting of a 5% target for Francophone immigration. I can assure you that all the work I carried out in that capacity went beyond party politics and was always dedicated to the needs and interests of Ontario's Francophone community.
I also held a variety of other ministerial mandates. I served successively as the Minister of Culture, Minister of Community and Social Services, Minister of Public Safety and Correction, and finally as Attorney General of Ontario. I served on the Treasury Board and the Management Board of the Government of Ontario for a number of years. I promoted a rigorous approach to fiscal control. Coming from a small business family, I treated public expenditure files with the same sense of prudence and foresight that I have learned from my parents, recognizing first and foremost that these were financial resources entrusted to us by all Ontarians. J'ai aussi assumé des charges ministérielles.
I also fulfilled ministerial duties that required a high degree of professional responsibility and public accountability. At the Ministries of Public Safety and Correctional Services, Community and Social Services, and the Attorney General, I dealt with highly confidential and sensitive, complex files. As the Attorney General of Ontario, it was my responsibility to ensure that all bills and all legal decisions by the government complied with the letter and spirit of the Canadian Constitution, and in that capacity, I also ensured that the rule of law was upheld in the exercise of authority. In my role as the legal advisor to Cabinet, I always had to act in an objective and non-partisan manner.
In Canada, I believe I offer a unique expertise. Over my 12 years as Ontario's Minister responsible for Francophone affairs, I created and maintained collaborative relationships throughout Canada's Francophone community, and I developed close relations with my colleagues from other provinces. Nationally, from 2003 to 2015, I participated in every single federal, provincial, and territorial Francophonie conference. Internationally, I attended 3 Francophonie summits. As part of the Canadian delegation, I contributed to the discussion and to the consensus that was reached by bringing to the table the unique and positive experience of Ontario, which is home to more than 600,000 Francophone and official language minority community that is increasingly diverse and dynamic. I am originally from Quebec, so I am also familiar with Quebec's English-speaking community, its challenges, and its aspirations. Tout au long de ma carrière, j'ai fait de
Throughout my career, I have made integrity and transparency the core virtues of my commitment to public life. My actions and decisions have been analyzed and scrutinized by the media, the public, and various political stakeholders. At all times, I have been able to publicly demonstrate my integrity. In my 25 years of public life, I have always adhered to the strictest rules of ethics and accountability associated with the positions I have held. In closing, if I have the privilege of holding the position of Commissioner of Official Languages, my priorities will include the following: making Canadians aware of the Commissioner's role, their rights and privileges under the Official Languages Act, and the remedies available to them to ensure that their rights are respected. Promoting and protecting the objective nature of the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages, promoting the active offer of services to Canadians in both languages.
Communities grow through immigration. The federal government has set some goals related to the recruitment of French-speaking immigrants in provinces and territories other than Quebec, their reception, their integration, their training, and their retention. The Office of the Commissioner will monitor how this file evolves to ensure that the department meets its objective that it has set for itself. This year, it's celebrating the 150th anniversary of Confederation. While the celebrations are expected to reflect both official languages and the history of our country's 2 founding people, the Office of the Commissioner must ensure that departments and agencies take their language obligation fully into account in the activities and services that they offer to the public. La loi sur les langues officielles aura bientôt.
The Official Languages Act will turn 50 soon, in 2019. It will be very important for the Office of the Commissioner to collaborate fully with the Secretary of the Treasury Board and with Canadian Heritage to modernize the Act and use new technologies to extend government services to a broader public in both official languages. Access to justice in both official languages, early childhood development, and bilingualism in the public service will be other subjects that will command the attention of the Office of the Commissioner. I have just discussed the key areas of focus that lie ahead of the Office of the Commissioner, and that will require leadership, experience, openness, and impartiality. Therefore, it is with confidence, fully aware of the challenges, but resolutely focused on the future, that I am prepared to assume the role of Commissioner of Official Languages. Thank you for your attention. I would be pleased to answer your questions. Thank you, Madame Mayor, for your presentation. So without further ado, we'll begin our round of questions and comments, and I'll begin with Bernard Généreux. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good day, Ms. Mayor. Thank you for being here today. With your career path and your past as a politician and a lawyer, you certainly do possess qualifications. The qualifications to occupy this position. But the question on everyone's lips is not that one, but it has to do with the process that led to your nomination. You must know that it's very well known now that your contributions in the past to the Liberal Party of Canada and in the leadership contest where Prime Minister Trudeau won, all of this, to a certain extent, casts a shadow over your candidacy insofar is that there is a certain partisanship. And in your speech, in your presentation, in 25 years of public life, you said that you've always adhered to the strictest rules of integrity. Do you consider that the fact that you contributed, you made voluntary political contributions, makes it such that the standards of accountability and ethics are accountable? Do you feel they are accountable? Answer. Well, these contributions, these financial contributions, were made when I was an MPP and a minister, and I acknowledge that in my new role, if I do indeed have the pleasure of holding this position, I will be nonpartisan, and I would like people to evaluate me, to judge me on what I will do, because I can't erase 13 years of politics. I can't erase 13 years of partisanship. Part of my job as a minister, I think this was very clearly shown. As Minister of Francophone Affairs, my aim was always to defend Francophones, and there was never any partisanship, because my aim, my goal, because I was the only Francophone woman in cabinet, so I advocated the Francophone cause, and I never let the fact that I was a member of a political party, I never let that lead me to lose my main goal, which was to advocate for Francophones. No, I understand that some people aren't pleased. And as I said, I have a passion for official languages. I've worked for 25 years in advancing the Francophone Fact in Ontario, here in the city of Ottawa and later in the Ontario government. And I commit to continue doing this while recognizing very clearly that this is a position that that needs great integrity and a complete absence of partisanship. Madame Meyer, you said that you carried out your work with integrity and competence. But this week, during an interview with TFO, you said, with respect to the criticism of the opposition, you said, I understand their reservations, but I don't think that that would make me unfit to hold this position, because we're talking about a nomination to the position of an officer of parliament. I think there already has been a former minister, Mr. Victor Goldblum, who was appointed to the position. It's about a year that you've left politics? Yes, at the end of June. So you left politics. In the same interview, you said to the interviewer of TFO, you said, I have a passion for Francophone matters. You thought about being a senator, but that the Prime Minister didn't want politicians in the upper chamber. And you would have, as a matter of fact, doubled your salary from one day to the next. So if, as you said, the Prime Minister doesn't want politicians in the upper house, said he doesn't want politicians in the upper chamber, but he wants politicians as officers of Parliament. Do you see the contradiction? Well, I left political life after 25 years, and I was clear that I was leaving political life not to leave public service. I want to continue to serve all Canadians and help them and have them benefit from my experience and my commitment to official languages. So yes, I did have an interest in the Senate, but I saw very quickly that they did not want to appoint politicians who just left politics, because Ms. Lankin, who was a former New Democrat in Ontario, she was appointed to the Senate, but she'd left politics for quite some time. So I didn't know at the time that the position of Official Languages Commissioner was open. Sorry, Bernard. No, when I learned that the position was open, I talked to the commissioner and the former commissioner, and I asked him to answer questions of mine, and he talked about his legacy, and it was then that I put my candidacy forward. Mr. Lefebvre. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Madame Meyer, welcome. As a Franco-Ontarian, I have watched your career and your role in La Francophonie with great interest. When you resigned last year, and I won't, on June 24th, 2016, Gilles Levasseur said in Franco Presse in an article, he said, Francophones have had an excellent representative of the French fact in Ontario.
And in another article on June 11th, the same year, they talked about the legacy of Madeleine Meyer, and it was said that Franco-Ontarians today have a commission that has total political independence. They can defend their cause before the commission. They also have a broadcaster, TFO, which is completely independent from TVO. So I actually sat on the board of TFO, and it was doing very well because of that decision. So I just wanted to get some of your comments So I just wanted to mention that comment. Also in Le Droit on June 11th, Huguette Young said that Madeleine Meilleur's departure leaves a hole that will be difficult to fill. Even her political adversaries had good things to say about her. For example, the member for Nickel Belt hadn't foreseen her departure. And according to her, Madeleine was a francophone before she was a liberal. She was an ally in the fight for defending francophone rights. And she told me that it would be good for me to ask a question about that because sometimes it was difficult to make that kind of good decision within the Liberal caucus. In an article in L'Express d'Orléans in 2012, it was said that the minister since 2003, Ms. Meilleur, has considered this position one of her greatest accomplishments in her career. And then you were quoted, "The creation of this position is a great point of pride for me because it's great for Franco-Ontarians." So I'd like to hear you about the independence of TFO, how important that is for Franco-Ontarians, and also about the independence of the Commission in Ontario. Great, thank you very much. First of all, I'm so proud of everything that we've accomplished for Francophones in Ontario. And I want to be very clear here. I didn't do any of this alone. I did it with the help of Franco-Ontarians. I did it with opposition members. I did it with my community. So I was alone in cabinet, but I felt that there were 600,000 Franco-Ontarians behind me. And that is what gave me that influence and weight. You mentioned France Gélinas. The two of us always worked very close together. She's also a great defender of the rights of Franco-Ontarians. And she is the president of an association in Ontario, and she gave me a really great card, which I would have liked to bring today, but I wanted to thank her publicly for all the work that we did together. Now, the position of commissioner, when I arrived as commissioner, it was certainly I had a very long list of things to do. I was arriving within the government, and there were a lot of people who helped me check off everything that was on my to-do list. They really helped me with my accomplishments. Of course, the most important thing to ensure that services provided in French continue to flourish is the creation of the Commissioner of French Language Services, the creation of that position. It was created in 2 stages. And I mention this because I recently gave a speech about the creation of this position. Now, not everyone likes to have an officer of parliament who is independent, who wasn't elected. So there were some objections, and those objections didn't just come from the opposition. A lot of them also came from my colleagues. So we worked to try and reassure them about their concerns. And when the decision to create the position was made, the first stage did not make it independent. I wasn't very happy with that because I wanted the position to be independent from the get-go. But, of course, it was better than nothing, and the Commissioner Bueno regularly said that this would be the case eventually, and of course the second stage was making the Commissioner independent. TFO was also a really great accomplishment. It has so much influence not only in Canada but also in the US. Currently, the CEO of TFO is in South Africa promoting the channel there. So it's really a great channel all around the world. I understand that Francois Choquette has shared his time with Mr. Mulcair. So, Mr. Mulcair, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good morning, Ms. Mayer. I'd like to go back to Mr. Généreus's comment, the quotation that he made. When you said that you would be able to make a contribution as a senator, but the Prime Minister said that he didn't want any political appointments in the upper chamber, who told you that? Who told you that the Prime Minister didn't want any political appointments there? Well, it was actually the chair of the committee who told me that this was the case. And later, that information was confirmed by the people who were in charge of recruitment for senators. Have you met Mathieu Bouchard? Yes. At his request, I met with Mr. Bouchard. And we talked about bilingualism in the city of Ottawa. In your opinion, should the city of Ottawa be a bilingual city? Yes, absolutely. Okay, that's interesting. I'd like to come back to something you mentioned earlier, a word you mentioned earlier to justify your own appointment. And I would like to say straight off that our objection to your appointment is formal and it is based on institutional issues. It's nothing personal. As an argument in your favor, you mentioned the appointment of Victor Goldbloom. Now, I've been working on official languages files for 35 years. I sat on the appeals board. I was also the director of legal affairs at Alliance Québec, where I worked on files dealing with access and control of Francophone school boards. I was also a counselor where I worked on those files. So, and of course, I looked at the translation of the laws of Manitoba after a Supreme Court ruling. So it's very important for me that whoever ends up in this position is not partisan. You mentioned the appointment of Victor Goldbloom, but I would suggest that that is not a good example. Victor Goldbloom was appointed by Brian Mulroney. So Brian Mulroney was a conservative who appointed a former liberal. So you see the difference. That is really the opposite of a partisan appointment. They were from two different parties. So Victor Goldbloom was indeed an excellent official languages commissioner, but everyone could see that he wasn't attached to the party who appointed him. So do you understand the difference? Yes, I do. So why don't you understand the importance of not accepting this basic argument? I'd like to quote a professor from BC. His name is Rémi Léger. You're smiling. Perhaps you know him? Or you're familiar with his writing? No, I'm not. Well, I'm going to quote this article. However, partisanship doesn't have its place in high-level appointments. The responsibility is for these people to go beyond political issues. Now, I would like to mention that the colleague across the way quoted you when you left as minister, but those are all quotations that you made as a politician. So in your case, this partisan appointment politicizes official languages at a time when we should be trying to defend higher principles. And that's our position. We believe that it is a monumental mistake on Prime Minister Trudeau's part to choose someone who helped with his own campaign, who contributed to the Federal Liberal Party. You need a certain amount of distance to be able to judge the actions of the Prime Minister. You don't have that necessary distance to be able to carry out that function. So does this give you pause as you quote cases that aren't really relevant to justify your appointment? Because this is a highly partisan appointment. You are too close to the Liberal Party, and in our opinion, Trudeau made a mistake. Well, I understand your concerns. the position was open, and so I decided to apply. I went through a very rigorous process. I firmly believe that I have the skills necessary for the position. And I know that I would be impartial in carrying out my functions if I am appointed. And if I am appointed, I hope that I would be judged by my behavior and my accomplishments rather than by the political position that I had a year before taking this office. Have you spoken to anyone in the Liberal Party about your desire to become commissioner? And if you did do this at some point, when and to whom did you speak? Well, yes, I said there was a position of senator available, and I did apply for that. Who did you speak to in the Liberal Party about becoming a senator? I spoke to Gerald Butts, someone I know well, because he worked for Mr. McGuinty in Toronto at the time, and I knew him well. So I spoke to him, and he explained that there was a process, an open and transparent process, and that I would have to go through that process, and that's what I did. So as I said earlier, I can't erase 13 years of a political career. No, but that's exactly the problem. Thank you very much, Tom. We're going to go to Mr. Sanson. Thank you very much, Ms. Mayer. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. I just want to go back to what you said earlier. You can't erase the last 13 years. Well, please don't erase them. The effective work that you did, all the work that you did to defend the Francophone minority in Ontario was exceptional. And I was so touched by your application for the position, because I can imagine how your work in Ontario can now be spread to the entire country. Imagine having someone who worked so hard to defend the cause of Francophones and Acadians in Ontario, in Canada, can now continue this work. And that's really exceptional, and I'm extremely happy that you applied, because this was an open and transparent process, and if you hadn't applied, it would have been a great loss for us, in my opinion. Another thing I'd like to raise is that I always said that a leader's merit doesn't depend on political parties. You can only really judge someone once they're in office and they've made their accomplishments. And so I'm so happy, because I think that in 5 or 7 years, I believe it's 7 years, if you are appointed, you will be able to really help Francophones and minority communities all across Canada. So I'd like to ask 2 questions. First, in your opinion, what are the priorities when it comes to your role at the federal level? And secondly, I'd like to talk a little bit about education. I was the Director General of French schools in Nova Scotia for 11 years. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about that, about charter schools that continue to improve the services that they offer. And I'd like to hear how you think the minority education system can continue, because of course it's very important, and of course there are certain provincial jurisdictions where there are issues, but I want to know what role you think the government can play in that. Thank you very much. Well, I am a great admirer of Acadians. I always say that it's easier to speak French in my little village where I came from in the Laurentians It's called Kiamika. If you don't know where it is, you really should. It's near Mont-Laurier. It's a little village of only about 250 people where no one spoke English when I was born and raised there. I also studied there, and then I came to Ontario to study nursing and to learn English because my father thought that it was important to be able to speak both languages. He was a unilingual francophone, and as a businessman, he found that that was a disadvantage. That said, the role of the commissioner is very well defined by the law. But I will talk a little bit more about your second question, education. Education is so important when it comes to ensuring that minorities, Anglophones in Quebec and Francophones elsewhere, have a strong, accessible education system, because that's the only way that you can slow assimilation and allow people to continue speaking their own language. So the investments and the work that the Commission can make, I mean, of course, Heritage also has a big role to play in helping official language minority communities, but the role of the Official Languages Commissioner is to encourage, whether it's through immigration targets, because of course that it was important to set a 5% target in Ontario, but it's so important to have accessible schools, to have a good education system, even if it's in an official language minority community. Sometimes they face greater challenges, and so that's why it's really important. As a minister in Ontario, I always worked very closely with the government of the time, and I also worked very closely with the Official Languages Commissioner, because we worked well together to ensure the survival of minority languages and to promote linguistic duality. So there are over 600,000 Francophones in Ontario, and there are different ways of increasing those numbers. Another example is when the definition of Francophone was changed. There are people who arrive in the country who don't speak English or French as a first language, but they speak French at home. So it was frustrating that those people weren't being included in the census. So we changed the definition of Francophone in Ontario. There are about 50,000 Francophones more now because we changed the way of counting them. And they wanted to be part of the Francophone community. They wanted to be counted. They didn't want to be excluded from that group because French wasn't their native language. Linda Lapointe. Good morning, Ms. Mayer. Welcome. I'm very pleased to welcome you today. Earlier, you said that you were from Kiamika in the Laurentians. Well, my riding is in the Lower Laurentians. I represent some of the mountains in that area, and the residents of that area near de Montagne and Rosemont. And there's also an Anglophone minority in my riding. So I have a question that is a bit more about this Anglophone minority. We've been talking a lot about Francophones, and I understand those issues well, but in Quebec there's sort of a mirror effect. We have the Anglophone minority, which represents 14% of the population, after all, which is a substantial number of people. I talked about my riding. My colleague talked about Francophone ridings too. But now, for your experience in Ontario, when you were dealing with issues related to health, the Montfort Hospital, for example, are there any practices that you used in Ontario that could be applied in Quebec when it comes to access to health care or perhaps access to justice? What is your viewpoint on that for the Anglophone minority in Quebec, understanding, of course, that the situation is a bit different? Well, I'll talk about my last portfolio. Access to justice in both official languages was a real priority for me. When I was Attorney General, I appointed bilingual judges because I wanted to fight against that deficit that existed in Ontario. They say justice delayed is justice denied. So I tried to fix that issue. I also appointed the first Franco-Ontarian Chief Justice of the busiest court in Canada, the Ontario Court.
So it's very important. It's very important to me. But I should say that the Anglophone community in Quebec is a community I know, but I'd like to know it better because we have a house in Gaspésie. I know Anglophones in that area. So it will be my first visit. My first visit will be to Quebec. I know that Anglophones there want to meet the new Official Languages Commissioner. There's going to be the awarding of the Victor Goldbloom Prize. I think we have a 5% target for French-speaking to get French-speaking immigrants, because Quebecers are worried about the falling demographic weight of Anglophones in Quebec, just as we're worried about the fall of Francophones in the rest of Canada. Well, outside urban centers like Montreal, the reality of English speakers is different. You talked about access to health and to justice. As soon as you get out of the cities, things are quite different, including what you said earlier. But Quebec is different from other provinces, and I would like to hear what you have to say about that. Well, health is a challenge as well in Ontario. I don't claim that we have a simple solution. We want French in healthcare to be a very important thing. We knew that the Montfort in Ottawa was helping to fill the gap, and there are also a lot of very qualified immigrants who come, and we want to make sure that their diplomas, etc., their professional certifications can be recognized so that they can go out and practice their professions. This is a challenge. This is something that falls within provincial jurisdiction, but as we also worked a great deal with the Official Languages Commissioner, when we set the 5% target, we did work with the Commissioner. So what I'd like to do is not work in silos, but work together to promote language and services in both official languages, and to meet the needs of Canadians of both official languages, minority communities of both official languages. Welcome, Madame Meyer. I'm an Acadian from New Brunswick, and so I was a minority and a majority. I went from kindergarten to through law school in my mother tongue, and this because of people like you. Because there were people in Nova Scotia knew that, and New Brunswick knew that it was education that would make the difference. I'm not trying to stump you, but I have a question on official languages. The Commissioner before had a certain framework, and I'm sure you've looked at all the parameters within which you can work. But Section 52 of the Act allows you to work with experts. So now, with respect to immigration, the numbers are really pitiful. How can we give greater vitality to minority communities? Do you think we should change direction? I know you're not yet in your position, but do you think that this is something that you would do as a new commissioner? Listen to experts. listen to those who have been historically consulted. Yes, I'm not yet commissioner, so I'm trying to read as much as I can and do as much as I can before I get to the position, if I have the privilege of being appointed. And also, I would look at recommendations and articles. The commissioner has flexibility, a certain flexibility, and I can assure you that I would do all I can, everything possible, to work in collaboration, because education is the perfect way to avoid assimilation and to give continued life to the community in speaking its language. There is a challenge, the challenge of exogamous families. That is a challenge. And some say French is the mother tongue, so how can we implement practices in our schools, in Ontario, for example, whether it's summer schools, in order to prepare young people who come from a mixed marriage, so to speak, an exogamous marriage, to get to school ready to learn. There are various methods, and I'm going to inquire into all methods I might adopt to support Acadians. Thank you very much.
Chair, and welcome, Madame Meilleur. First question, I just want to clarify some information you provided to Mr. Mulcair. You mentioned that someone informed you that you wouldn't be appropriate as a senator. You mentioned the chair of the committee. Could you confirm who that was, what committee you were referring to?
I missed your question because when I was asked, who, the chair, sorry, the chair of the Madame Labelle, who is responsible for the appointment, recruitment and selection and appointment to the Senate.
So is it common for prospective senators to meet privately with an independent chair of an independent commission to appoint independent senators?
Mind you, I had invited her before I resigned as the chair, as the member of parliament. So I have invited her to come to a presentation to La Journée de la Femme. And she was there, and we asked that question. But I went forward and applied anyway.
So you were actively considering alternative employment before leaving as an MPP?
Yes, because I was resigning as the MPP, but not in public life. So I wanted to continue to work in public life.
Okay. Who informed you that you would be nominated as the official languages commissioner?
Who informed me?
Who informed you that you'd be the successful nominee?
I got a telephone call that my name was going to put forward to the Premier Minister.
And who called you?
A staff from the Minister of Justice.
Okay. And on what date was that?
It was late at the end of April, I think. I don't have the exact date. But,
okay, but in the April timeframe?
I think so, yes. That my name was going to put forward. They didn't told me that I was going to be appointed.
Okay, but your name would be going
because,
forward. Okay.
You know, I understand that there is a process. So.
Okay. So during the months since you've left as an MPP, you mentioned you had conversations with Gerald Butts. Were there others you had conversations with, such as Katie Telford or Matthew Mendelson?
No.
No, neither of those people?
Katie, yes, yes, I had a coffee with Katie, and you know, I was asking if you know, there was if I could offer, you know, my service to serve Canadian, and you know, there was no retroaction about, you know, what just, I'd like to continue to serve.
Do you know if most candidates for the Official Languages Commissioner had the opportunity to meet with Mr. Butts and Ms. Telford?
I don't know because I don't know who else had applied.
Okay. How many interviews did you go through leading up to the appointment?
I went to two interviews.
And who was on the panels when you were being interviewed?
With the first panel, there was 10 persons. I think most of them were civil servant, and there was a representative from the Minister of Patrimoine, Heritage Minister, and one representative from the Office of the Premier Minister.
Now, in the days and weeks since you've been officially nominated, has there been someone at the Prime Minister's office who's been advising you on the process?
Le conseil privé, they advise me on the process, that I need to come before this committee and then the Senate, and before my appointment would be confirmed. Or
Now, you mentioned that you'd like to take your first visit to Quebec after you're appointed. Do you plan to take a number of trips across Canada?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, indeed, because I know the community, the Francophone community outside of Quebec, but I cannot say that I know everyone. I met them, when I was the minister, and we had this FPT meeting across the province, and we were changing provinces every time. And so I have met, and I'm so impressed, to see that, they are a small percentage of the community, and they're so vibrant. And but I know less the core of the Anglophone community, which is in Montreal, in Quebec. I know that there is, Monsieur le Président, a large Anglophone community in your area, so I wanted to make sure that I get to know them.
So I guess my follow-up to that is, do you consider this to be a full-time position, and will you be undertaking this as a full-time position? I know when you resigned as the MPP, you said, you wanted to spend more time with your family, be closer to home. That seems at odds with undertaking, a 7-year appointment as an active commissioner of official languages. It seems to be at odds. At one point, you're saying you want to spend more time with your family. On the other hand, you're undertaking a very exciting position. Can you reconcile that for me?
When I resigned, yes, I wanted to spend more time with my family, especially that my husband went through a very difficult and challenging health situation, which he has recovered fully now. So I'm very pleased. But I wanted to. It's going to be a full time, and you will see. I always had 3 jobs. I was an MPP, I was a Minister of Francophone Affairs, and I always had another ministry. And I think that I fulfill all these responsibility. And I was, out and visit, especially in the Francophone community. It's small community, and it's not as easy as going to Montreal or going to Toronto because the flight and all of this. So I spend a lot of time traveling into a small community, and I miss that, and I wanted to continue.
Thank you very much, John. We might come back later. René Arsenault.
Madame Meyer, toujours dans la...
Madame Meyer, again, let's get practical. I'd like to put a question, one like my colleagues. Do you foresee, if this appointment is confirmed, I'm talking hypothetically, do you think there's something you could add, something you could bring to your job if you're officially appointed? You mean other than my work as a commissioner? No, I'm talking about a new approach. Well, first of all, I have big shoes to fill. The commissioner has done extraordinary work, and I always supported his idea of partnership. I always appreciated the sound advice he gave me, and as I said, when we set a 5% target for Francophone immigration, he helped me with approaches. Well, I will bring my own personality, my own approach, and I will be open to suggestions because I listen to people a lot. I listen more than I speak when I meet with communities. They will talk to me about their needs, about their aspirations and their challenges. So is this one of the duties of a commissioner? Well, I think we can get across to the authorities some advice. I mean, the commissioner has to maintain his or her independence, but can listen, and especially to official language minority communities. Now, Mr. Vandal, thank you very much, Ms. Mayer. It's a pleasure to meet you. I represent Saint-Boniface. I'm a métis from Saint-Boniface. In his 10th and last report, Graham Fraser said that the way in which federal services are delivered to official language minority communities has to be better defined. In Manitoba, there's a lot to be done. In places like Saint-Eustache or Saint-Pierre, there's a lot to be done. I'd like to know your perspective and your priorities for official language services in minority communities. Well, first, I'd like to salute Senator Chaput, who's done extraordinary work. I hope that her bill is adopted, but she's given a great start to looking not only at the numbers, but at the level of vitality of a given community. We want to ensure the vitality of communities through culture, through education, through healthcare services. I think healthcare services represent the greatest challenge. We have to work on that file. So I know small villages as well. I really don't know, except for Fisher Branch, I don't know villages in Manitoba, but I do know very small towns in Ontario. Most Francophones in Ontario live in very small towns, so how can we support them and help them keep their language, whether through a funding program or through a study? Because I know that Mr. Fraser conducted a study on media, on newspapers, French language newspapers and other publications. I have to make sure his recommendations are agreed. So you do go to Manitoba? Yes, I go a lot. I met with Premier Selinger, who had been the Minister of Francophone Affairs. He was the Dean of Francophone Affairs Ministers. And I had the opportunity to visit there on several occasions, and I did talk about our cooperation agreement with TFO. I announced this in Manitoba, so it was a great partnership.
And in Ontario, we tried to share and to sell to other communities, like New Brunswick, this idea. So that commission did quite a bit of work to promote that as well, and we exchanged best practices. I have another question. How much time do I have, Mr. Chair? Time for one more? Good. France Gélinas' words really struck me. This was an NDP member who said that Madeleine Meillard is a francophone first and a liberal second. Could you comment on that very meaningful quotation? Well, as I said at the beginning, I was the only francophone in cabinet. I was the only francophone in cabinet for 12 and a half years. So I was the defender of francophones, and I was also the commissioner for francophones before there really was a commissioner. So for me, when the opposition asked a question, it helped me move forward on these files, like questions about the Francophone University. I had proposed to the previous commissioner that she be the president of this Francophone University. She sent me an email this morning. And France used to ask a lot of questions about Francophone universities to move forward with that file, and she's still working on that. So all of that helps the Minister of Francophone Affairs move forward on files. So it's not a bad thing to be asked questions. And sometimes people would give me a heads up and say, hey, is it all right if I ask this question? And I would say, yes, of course, it'll help me.
No? You're coming back, John?
Quick questions.
Okay,
yes.
John.
First of all, I was remiss in not mentioning the first time, thank you for your service, incidentally, for your many years of service. We don't have a problem with you as a person. I think you've done an exceptional job in a number of files. I do want to put that on the record because this is about process. It's not about you as an individual in most circumstances. I just want to follow up quickly. Section 49(1) of the Official Language Act requires consultation. Now, you had mentioned earlier to a question that you were informed in April that your name would be going forward. Our leader, Madame Ambrose, was informed on May 8th about this nomination and the request for consultation. So I find it at odds with the requirement of the Official Languages Act of consultation when you were informed in April, and the consultation didn't happen until May 8th. And I'm not sure about the New Democratic leader, but I assume it's the same time frame. Do you have a comment on that?
But listen, I don't want to answer on the process. No, I'm not responsible for the process. There was a position that was open. I applied for the position. I went through a rigorous process, and I have been selected because of my competence and because of my feuille de route. And I'm excited about working in official languages. I cannot wait to start if I'm the successful candidate, and I hope that I will be able to go into your community to speak to the Francophone. I know you're a provincial colleague, a wonderful, wonderful supporter of Les Affaires Francophones also.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll pass now to Mr. Hoback.
Actually, I'll build on that because that's where the problem starts to come into play. And again, your service and stuff, it's not personal. It's just, if you put yourself in my shoes, now I'm looking at you coming in as a former Liberal MPP. I'm looking at the process where the government didn't even follow the appropriate process. If they would have, maybe in May or in April, came to us and said, we're considering this person, what do you think? Then we would have had input into that whole process. And we probably would not be here in this type of tone at this point in time. But they didn't do that. So now let's say you take on the role of official languages, and you're in a scenario where now you have to make a decision. Since the process isn't properly followed, how do I have confidence in that decision was made based on your expertise? And how do I do not have in the background thinking, there's some liberal partisanship going on here, so it's always going to hang over any decision you make, even if it's the correct decision. So how do we handle that scenario? which makes this really difficult.
Listen, I understand your point. I understand Monsieur Molker's point. There was other person, not the official language commissioner, but their appointment was very controversial. And and they end up doing a good job. You know, people are very happy with their. We appointed judges that had come from a political background, or our former Attorney General in Ontario, you know, was.
You can even use the example of Gary Dewar. Mr. Harper appointed him into the ambassadorship in the U.S. But in that scenario, it was an NDP premier and a Conservative prime minister. And you could see that it made sense. There was actually a left-leaning president in the U.S., so that made a lot of sense. The issue I have here now is just because of your history with the Liberal Party, you know, let's say in the scenario, Katie Telford phones you now that you're a commissioner. She phones you up and says, let's go for coffee. Do you take the phone call? Do you go for coffee? How do you recluse yourself from what that conversation may be involved on in that coffee? Just a general, how's your day going, could lead into a conversation in one of your investigations or in something that she's saying. So how do you put that wall in place to create or stay away from those types of conflicts of interest?
I recognize that that I will have be very prudent, very, very prudent, because, you know, to be objective, it's not just to say, it's to have the appearance also. So I will make sure that I am, like I said, very prudent to make sure that, you know, people see that, you know, in my new function, I'm very impartial and very neutral, and I hope I will be judged by my comportement and my results.
You know, I'll use the example, the Prime Minister had an investigation in official language in January because of an answer he gave in English or in French in Quebec. In that scenario, would you recluse yourself from all your Liberal friends in that scenario? Would you say, you know what, guys, I can't talk to any of you until I'm done this investigation? Because reality, it will come into the conversation whether we like it or not. It's just, we're humans. That's what happens. And if you came back with a decision and said that, no, he's not in conflict, how do I say, well, wait a minute, how do I know she wasn't influenced by a conversation she had with a former Liberal senator or with a former Liberal Party member? It'll always be a cloud of doubt in that judgment, even though it might have been the correct judgment. So how do I overcome that? How do I get over that? I just look at the process that they followed here, and they made it impossible for us to get over that type of scenario.
Yes, but I'm going to repeat it again. You know, I'm not going to erase 13 years. I'm very proud of what I did and my work that I did. I went through a process. There was an opening, and I put my name forward. I went through a rigorous, and I knew that I would have a difficult, path to become the commissioner, not because I questioned myself.
The process wasn't going to be followed properly. If you knew the process consisted of the fact that they weren't going to consult, like it says in legislation, with the opposition parties, would you still let your name stand?
I'm not talking about this process.
But you were talking about the process.
No, I'm
you
not
said
going
you went
to
through a
comment.
process.
I'm not going to comment about this part. I'm just
But
saying.
you're using the process to justify taking on the job. And I'm saying if you're doing that, then you're also saying that the process is legitimate. And we're saying we have a problem with the process because the Liberal Party didn't follow the appropriate process. So again, it comes back to how do I square a decision you make in the future and not think that it's a partisan decision?
Listen, I think that I cannot say more than what I've just said. You know, it's going to be by my comportement and of course, you know, there is the employee at the commissariat. You know, like there is 160 more employee. You know, the commissioner is like. I know that at the end of the day, you know, the buck stops here. I recognize that.
So,
but I will always do that with the respect and the integrity and the independence that the position requires.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Randy. We'll go. On va aller maintenant avec Tom Mulcair. Tom.
We'll go to Tom Mulcair for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, rather. Ms. Mayer.
Opens up around the Prime Minister, will you recuse yourself because of the fact that you donated to his leadership campaign?
Listen, I don't even know if the commissioner can recuse himself or herself. And the situation is, I will get advice if the situation. I think it's a unique situation, and if the situation, occur, I will look to advice. But my position as a commissioner is an independent and neutral.
Well, you see, that's the whole point, isn't it? If you've contributed to the campaign to elect Justin Trudeau Prime Minister, you contributed to the campaign to elect Justin Trudeau leader of the Liberal Party. You are yourself a lifelong Liberal. That's the very problem, you see. You talk about an independent decision, but how can a decision be independent with someone who you were cheerleading for, somebody who you wanted to be in that job? Can you have the independence necessary to judge him and his government? That's the job. That's why it's called a commissioner. It's not the director general of an agency. It's not a deputy minister. It's a commissioner, an officer of parliament, someone above the fray. That's why this can't work. Do you understand our position?
I understand your position, but I'll say that I'm confident that I can, fill the role of Commissioner of Official Languages with all the integrity and the independence that the position requires.
That's a nice formula, and no one's questioning your personal integrity. I want to be very clear on that. But what I'm also saying is the facts are against a credible argument that you can do this independently. Tout à l'heure, vous avez dit, quand j'ai appris que le poste était ouvert.
Earlier you said, when I learned that the position was available. Well, who informed you that the position was available? The commissioner, Graham Fraser? Yes. He called you to say the position's available? No, he didn't call me. Well, I had resigned, and then... Well, but in what context did he tell you this? In the street. In the street, Graham Fraser told you that the position was available? But at the same time, he said that there were other people interested. And as I said, so I found out about this. And later on, when it was posted, then I believe there had been an email sent out to everyone who was interested. Mr. Fraser sent an email to everyone who was interested? He sent you an email. Yes, but he sent it to other people too. You know this? Yes, well, he's very impartial. So he said, everybody who wants to meet with me, I will meet with them. And he said, I am impartial, so I don't want to, I certainly don't want to taint him. No, of course, nobody's going to taint Mr. Fraser. When was the last time that you spoke to Justin Trudeau? I haven't spoken to him since I resigned. So what was the last time that you spoke to Justin Trudeau? I think it was an event in Toronto with some lawyers who were having a reception for Mr. Trudeau. What sort of reception? A dinner. A dinner with lawyers? Yes. And you were there? Yes. Is this what's sometimes called a Liberal Party fundraising dinner? I don't know if it was a fundraising dinner or not. Could you get back to us on that? Because I'm not just asking you this. I mean, I understand you don't have your agenda with you, but could you get back to us and tell us exactly what type of a dinner this was? Well, they were Indo-Canadian lawyers. Okay, well, we're still waiting for an official answer, okay, to find out if it was a fundraising activity or not. Are you still a member of the Liberal Party? No. Since when? I think the end of the year, you think? That's something that can be checked too. So would you be able to get back to us, get back to the chair of the commission when you left the Liberal Party? Yes. Two other questions. You already said that you would like Ottawa to be a bilingual city. I would love to see bilingual signage here in my native city. I was born in Ottawa, like you. And I'm always still surprised that in this bilingual country, there's no bilingual signage in the capital. So I would be eager to see you push for that. But two questions. First of all, we already proposed two things that are important to you. First of all, a legislative obligation to have bilingual judges. That's still not formalized. Would you agree with that idea? Absolutely. Did you say all judges? Supreme Court justices. Okay, yes, absolutely, I agree. Secondly, it's been 40 years since the Quebec employees have had the right to receive French language communication from their employers. And somebody who works in a federal bank wouldn't have right to get that documentation in French. So do you agree with us that that right should extend to someone working in federal things like charter banks? Well, I've never given any thought to the question. But now you said that you had a bill to that end? Oh, that's very good. Yes, but on the question of the basic principles, should someone working in a charter bank also have the right to get French language correspondence from their employer? Well, I can't answer right now. It's difficult to just show up here and give you an answer without having had the time to study the situation and to get legal opinions on that issue.
Constitutional guarantees that have been extended and interpreted as applying to school commissions of the linguistic minority. That was the Maé decision. There have been a series of court decisions that have extended that, including, of course, to the English-speaking community of Quebec. Last year, the Quebec government put forward a bill that would have eliminated school boards, including English language school boards. What would be your position if that bill was to be put forward as official language commissioner? How would you situate yourself with regard to the constitutional right of the English-speaking minority in Quebec to have care and control of school boards of the linguistic minority?
What I can say, it's in Ontario, you know, they have the francophone community have the control of their school board.
Talking about a province that put forward legislation to eliminate all school boards, including the minority school boards.
Listen, I cannot answer this right now. I would be very interested into looking into it, but you know, to ask me as I appear here to give you, you know, a legal opinion from the commissaire or commissariat au service en français.
Merci beaucoup, Tom. Merci.
In both cases, it wasn't a legal opinion so much as a feeling for your reflexes. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci, Tom. Bernard Généreux. On commence juste, vous aviser qu'avec le temps.
I should mention that time is short, so we'll just do a 3-minute round after. Ms. Mayer, to summarize, you spoke to Mr. Butts. You had a coffee with Ms. Telford from the PMO, both of them. You spoke to the Official Languages Commissioner. You were at a dinner for the Prime Minister. Do you think that all of the other candidates for this job had the same privileges that you had to get to this point? Absolutely not. But I'll repeat my question. Do you think that all of the candidates had the same privileges as you? The same access? Well, I thought you meant having access to those people. Okay, let me back up here. Okay, I'll ask again. Do you think that all candidates applying for this position had the same privileges as you, the same benefits to access to the post? Absolutely, because, as I said, this is a rigorous process. Listen, the position was available. I applied. I have a record. I'm just saying what I did. Look, I'm sorry, I only have 3 minutes, but you gave $5,000 to the Liberal Party of Canada, $5,000 to Mr. Trudeau's leadership campaign. Now, I don't think that all of the candidates did that. Well, I couldn't say. But you're telling me that by giving those sums of money, by meeting with Mr. Butts, by having coffee with Ms. Telford, by meeting the commissioner, by going to a dinner with the Prime Minister, I mean, certainly that gave you some amount of advantage or visibility among government people. Well, again, I applied. I have my record. I got an interview. I got a second interview. And I went through all of the steps of the process, and I was selected. I was selected as the candidate for this position. Now, I'm not yet the commissioner. I've been selected, and I can say that I'm passionate about official languages, and I'm very eager to start work if I am given this position. I'll give my last minute to Mr. Mulcair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Who were the two people on the selection committee that you said were from the PMO and from the Department of Heritage? What were their names? I don't have their names. One was named Martin Bouchard. Was it Mathieu Bouchard? Yes, that's right. I'm sorry. So he was from the PMO. And from Heritage, well, we spoke about Monsieur Bouchard earlier, and you mentioned him as being on the committee. And who was the person from Heritage? I don't have their name. You don't have any record of who was on the selection committee? You didn't make note of that? No. I don't have the names of the people who were there. I know there were deputy ministers there, 3 of them. There were people from the Privy Council, I believe. Did you get an explanation about why you were given a heads up by the Minister of Justice? Why you were told by her that you were chosen? I didn't get an explanation, but I was told that the position, well, that there were 2 ministers who were supposed to make a recommendation about the candidates. Thank you very much, Tom. We're going to move to Paul Lefebvre for 3 minutes.
Well, what I'm inferring is that there is partisanship. Here, you talked about the roadmap. You talked about being the Minister of Francophone Affairs in Ontario. Did you play a role in being nominated? Well, yes, I wanted the position. I wanted the position because if I knew if I were there, I could be independent. Did you ever have to fight for things in cabinet? Yes, I did, but the fight was an easy one because people saw from that the commissioner did have the necessary independence. What about an independent TFO? Did you have a role in this? Well, TFO is affiliated with TVO, and Francophones weren't really being well served. So this all came from your leadership. And you talk about 5% immigration, that target. Did you have a role in that? Yes. I spoke with the minister and I said we should set an objective because we were losing in terms of demographic weight as Francophones. So you played a key role in that. Now, Montfort Hospital has become a teaching center. Well, Montfort Hospital is my alma mater. I practiced as a nurse there. Now, I'm old enough that I had my career as a nurse there. And I was at the head of the parade when the government wanted to close the Montfort Hospital. I was there in the front lines fighting against the closure, and I was very happy when it was announced that the hospital would become a bigger hospital and that there would be become a center of healthcare services in French. Now, do you think that why do you think you are the best candidate? Well, my objective is to work in official languages, so I thought I could do so perhaps through the Senate. Now, that's not possible. And when I learned that the Official Languages Commissioner's position would be open, now I've been 25 years in public life. There were 4 of us as town councillors who worked for bilingual services in the city of Ottawa. So this, in a way, is a fine way to end my career. Well, it's clear you have what's required for the position. And now 2 3-minute questions. François Charquette, who will be giving his time to Mr. Mulcair.
The process. Tom.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Gerald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gerald Butts, Katie Telford, Mathieu Bouchard.
And who was on your own selection committee. That, for us, is a source of real concern. That's political. That's partisan. That's not neutral. That's not transparent. That's not open. That's political. Il y a un détail qui me préoccupe aussi. C'est la présence.
There is a detail that concerns me, and that's the presence of someone from the Department of Justice and people from the Department of Justice getting in touch with you to tell you you were nominated. The Minister of Justice herself. Well, I don't know what the Minister of Justice would be doing, because everyone should be defending official language minorities against the government. You have to be defending the rights of these communities against the Minister of Justice and against the department. And here the Minister of Justice informed you of all this. These are people, this is someone you're going to have to ask to be accountable. I'd like to talk to you about the federal court's Martineau ruling. They talk about the role of the commissioner, and it says that as a senior parliamentary officer, and that officer was Graham Fraser, that this officer is supposed to give Parliament impartial advice based on objective information in order to assist them in playing a frontline role, and that is to hold the government to account for the equality of French and English as official languages. This need to be able to call the government to account, and especially after everything we've heard today, after all we've heard, we're less convinced than ever that both in terms of form as in terms of substance, that this fictive consultation was an error, and it would undermine the credibility of the position of official language commissioner.
Randy.
Yeah, just I want to just follow up a question. You mentioned you talked to the former minister or official language commissioner about universities and colleges for post-employment. What were those colleges again?
L'Université francophone in Ontario.
Okay.
We have started that, like a few years ago. We would like to have a francophone university in Ontario.
Okay.
Completely francophone.
Yep.
And
when did you talk to him about that?
We have appointed her to, I recommended her name just before I left, to be
While
on...
you were an MPP?
Pardon?
When you were still an MPP, you recommended
Yes,
her
when I
name
was
to...
Minister of Francophone Affairs.
Okay.
Okay, to review, and make recommendation to the government what structure this new university should have.
So were you aware at the time then that the person would not be seeking to be renominated to this post at that point in time when you recommended her to that university, proposed university?
We recommended her as the chair of the committee that will give recommendation to the government for the creation of this Université francophone.
Also, it's just the chair of the committee that's
Yes.
going to develop.
Yes,
And this
but
is
because of her you know, because of she was the president at Glendon, so she has quite an experience in it. And also as a former commissioner of official languages, you know, and she's very militant for Francophone in Ontario and minority situations. So we thought, I thought that she was a good person to be in that position.
Okay. Bernard, did you have one more question?
Si vous permettez, la rencontre que vous avez dit.
If you'll allow, the meeting you had was in Toronto with a reception for lawyers. Was the Prime Minister present? No, it was during the election campaign. It wasn't after. It was during the election campaign. Well, the minister didn't know she was going to be a minister. She was from British Columbia. So was it a funding event? Was there an entry fee to take part in the event, to attend it? Did you have to pay to attend the event? Well, I don't think it was a funding event. There were people from the department who were there. Do you think we could get the same information Mr. McKinnon asked for? Well, yes, I went there when I was minister. Thank you very much, Bernard. Thank you, Madame Meyer, for your answers to the members' questions. And I have to tell you that next week we'll be in our ridings. So when we get back from the break week, from our riding week, we will be dealing this. Thank you very much for appearing. Well, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you. Thank you for the welcome you've given me. I know I don't have the position yet, but I want to try to convince people of my independence, my integrity, and my impartiality. And I can't erase 13 years of active political life. I'm very happy that I had these years of public service and of the work I've done for Francophones in Ontario. And you should be proud of that. Thank you, Madame Meyer. We'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back with committee business.